My father humiliated me in front of our entire family, calling me a worthless failure who would never be a real man. But 3 days later, I found a box hidden in our attic filled with explicit letters that revealed his darkest secret. What I discovered about his hidden addiction to forbidden desires changed everything I thought I knew about him and about myself. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Diego, and I'm 28 years old. But for most of my life, I felt like I was living in someone else's shadow, constantly trying to measure up to standards I could never reach. Growing up as an only child in a strict Christian conservative household meant every single mistake I made was magnified, every decision scrutinized, and every moment of my existence compared to some impossible version of the perfect son my father had in his mind. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately feel like you don't belong? That was my entire childhood. Except the room was my own home, and the person making me feel inadequate was the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally. My father wasn't just strict. He was relentless in his criticism, always pointing out how I wasn't man enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't faithful enough. And honestly, after years of hearing it, I started believing every single word. I became a freelance graphic designer because I couldn't handle the pressure of traditional office environments where I'd have to interact with people constantly, where my social anxiety would kick in and remind me of every harsh word my father ever spoke about my inability to be confident around others. Dating was a nightmare because every time I got close to someone I could hear his voice in my head telling me I wasn't worthy of love, that I was weak, that no real woman would ever want someone like me. I spent most of my 20s alone in my apartment, working on design projects, scrolling through social media, watching other people live the lives I was too scared to pursue. And the worst part is that I convinced myself this isolation was normal, that this was just who I was supposed to be. But here's what I didn't understand then. What took me years of pain and discovery to realize. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are fighting battles we can't see, carrying secrets so heavy that they lash out at others just to release some of the pressure building inside them. My father's cruelty toward me wasn't really about me at all. It was about the war raging inside his own heart, the desires he was desperately trying to suppress, the addiction to forbidden pleasures that was eating him alive from the inside out. See, when someone constantly attacks your character, your worth, your very essence as a person, they're usually projecting their own shame onto you because it's easier than facing what they hate about themselves. I grew up thinking I was broken, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. But the truth is, my father was the one who was broken, living a double life that required him to be twice as harsh on everyone else just to maintain the illusion of his own righteousness. This story isn't just about family secrets or hidden addictions. It's about how shame becomes a poison that spreads through generations, how the people we love can become our greatest enemies when they're at war with themselves, and how sometimes the most painful discoveries can set us free from years of believing lies about who we really are. If you've ever felt like you're not enough, like you're constantly disappointing the people who matter most, like you're trapped in a cycle of trying to earn love that should be freely given, then you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you need to hear what happened next, because it changed everything. I thought I knew about my family, about my father, and most importantly, about myself. Christmas dinner was supposed to be a peaceful family gathering, but the moment I mentioned that I was considering moving to another state to expand my freelance business, everything changed in the most humiliating way possible. Picture this. We're all sitting around my grandmother's dining table, the whole extended family together for the first time in months. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone sharing stories and laughing. And I thought this would be the perfect moment to share some positive news about my life for once. I had been working with a potential client in Colorado who wanted to bring me on full-time. It was an amazing opportunity that could finally give me the independence and confidence I had been lacking for years. So I cleared my throat and said, I had an announcement to make. The room went quiet as I explained the job opportunity and how I was thinking about relocating, expecting maybe some congratulations or at least supportive questions about my plans. But instead, my father's face turned dark and his jaw clenched in that way that always meant trouble was coming. Before I could even finish explaining the details, he slammed his fist on the table so hard that glasses shook and gravy spilled. Then he stood up and pointed at me like I was on trial for some terrible crime. What came out of his mouth next will haunt me forever, because he didn't just disagree with my decision. He attacked my entire existence as a human being in front of everyone I cared about. He called me a coward who was running away from his problems instead of facing them like a real man. Then he said I was a complete failure who had never accomplished anything meaningful in my 28 years of life. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, he looked me dead in the eyes and told the entire family that I was only half a man who had never had the courage to do anything, especially when it came to relationships with women. Can you imagine sitting there while your own father destroys your character in front of your grandparents, your aunts who helped raise you, your cousins who looked up to you? The silence in that room was deafening as everyone stared at their plates, too uncomfortable to speak, too shocked to defend me. And I felt my face burning with shame as tears started forming in my eyes. My father wasn't done, though. He kept going, saying that moving away wouldn't change the fact that I was weak, that no matter where I went I would still be the same pathetic excuse for a man who couldn't even get a girlfriend, let alone build a real life for himself. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest, because part of me believed what he was saying. Part of me had always wondered if he was right about my inadequacies, and hearing it spoken out loud in front of everyone made it feel like an undeniable truth. I wanted to fight back, to defend myself, to show him that I was stronger than he thought. But instead, I just sat there, frozen, feeling like that scared little boy who could never live up to his father's expectations. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was seeing the look of pity in my relatives' eyes, knowing that this moment would define how they saw me forever, and realizing that my own father cared more about his anger than about protecting his son's dignity. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to leave town the next morning and never look back, but when I went to pack my things, I discovered something that would turn my entire understanding of my father upside down. Drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, feeling completely broken and humiliated, replaying every cruel word my father had said in front of our entire family. The house felt suffocating when I walked in, knowing that upstairs my parents were probably discussing what a disappointment I was. So I went straight to my old bedroom and started throwing clothes into a suitcase, determined to leave first thing in the morning and never come back. But then I remembered I had left some important documents and childhood memories in the attic, things I would need if I was really going to start over somewhere else. So around midnight I climbed up there with a flashlight to gather my belongings. The attic was dusty and filled with boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture, but in the corner I spotted something I had never seen before. A medium-sized wooden box with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. My heart started racing because I thought maybe it contained letters or photos from my childhood, maybe even some sentimental items my father had saved over the years, which would have been completely out of character for him but still gave me a tiny spark of hope that maybe he did care about me somewhere deep down. When I opened that box, my entire world collapsed in a way I never could have imagined, because inside were dozens and dozens of handwritten letters. But they weren't childhood memories or family photos. They were explicit love letters addressed to my father from different men. And I'm talking about graphic, passionate, deeply intimate correspondence that spanned over 15 years. My hands were trembling as I read letter after letter, each one more shocking than the last, describing secret meetings in hotel rooms, passionate encounters, and desperate declarations of love from men who were clearly having long-term affairs with my father. There were photographs too, pictures that I can't even begin to describe. showing my father in compromising situations with various men. Images that proved beyond any doubt that the man who had spent my entire life preaching about traditional values and Christian morality was living a completely double life. The names on the letters were different: Michael, David, Carlos, Roberto, and others, spanning back to when I was just a teenager, which meant that while my father was lecturing me about being a real man and finding a good woman, he was secretly meeting with men behind my mother's back and behind the back of our entire religious community. I sat in that attic for hours, reading through everything, feeling sick to my stomach but unable to stop, because every letter revealed more about the man I thought I knew. And suddenly, his harshness toward me started making a twisted kind of sense. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen this. I needed answers about why he had tortured me for years while hiding this massive secret, so I decided to track down one of the men from the letters. Roberto was the name that appeared most frequently, and his letters were the most recent, dating back to just 2 years ago. So I used social media to find him and discovered he was a contractor who still lived in our town. It took me 3 days to work up the courage, but I finally approached Roberto at his worksite and told him who I was. And the look of shock and fear on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even said a word. We met at a coffee shop the next evening, and what Roberto told me changed my understanding of my father forever. Because he explained that their relationship had lasted 8 years, and that my father was constantly torn between his desires and his religious beliefs. Roberto said my father would cry after their encounters, talking about how much he hated himself for his feelings, how he was terrified of going to hell, how he felt like a fraud every Sunday when he sat in church with our family. But here's the part that hit me like a punch to the gut. Roberto told me that my father talked about me constantly during their time together, always expressing frustration and anger because he said I reminded him of everything he could never be, that I had a freedom and authenticity that he envied and resented at the same time. Roberto explained that my father would rage about how I was too soft, too sensitive, too comfortable with who I was, and that it drove him crazy because he wished he could be that open about his own identity, but felt trapped by decades of religious conditioning and social expectations. Everything suddenly made perfect sense in the most painful way possible. My father wasn't attacking me because I was weak. He was attacking me because I represented the freedom he had never allowed himself to have. And every cruel word he spoke was really directed at his own internal struggle with shame and self-hatred. The next morning I walked into our kitchen holding that wooden box, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And when my father looked up from his newspaper and saw what I was carrying, his face went completely white. I set the box down on the table between us and said very quietly that we needed to talk. And I watched as his eyes darted to the box and then back to my face. And I could see the panic building in his expression, even though he was trying to maintain his usual stern composure. When I opened the box and pulled out the first handful of letters, his immediate reaction was to slam his hand down and shout that I had no right to go through his personal belongings, that I was invading his privacy and violating the trust of our family. He tried to grab the letters from my hands, demanding to know where I had found them and what I thought I was doing, his voice getting louder and more aggressive as he accused me of being a snoop and a troublemaker who was trying to destroy our family. But I held firm and told him I knew about Roberto, about Michael, about all of them, and that I had already spoken to Roberto, who had told me everything about their 8-year relationship. The color drained from his face completely when I said Roberto's name, and for a moment he just stood there frozen, staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. Then the denials started pouring out in a desperate flood. He swore that I was making everything up, that those letters were fake, that I was delusional if I thought he would ever engage in that kind of behavior. He started pacing around the kitchen, his voice getting higher and more frantic as he insisted that I was trying to ruin his reputation and destroy his marriage, that I was a sick person for even suggesting such things about my own father. I had never seen him this panicked before, and part of me wanted to back down because seeing him so afraid was almost more disturbing than his usual anger. But I knew I had to push through because I needed the truth after a lifetime of his lies. So I pulled out one of the photos and placed it on the table, and when he saw it, something inside him just snapped. He started screaming at me, calling me terrible names, accusing me of setting him up and plotting against him, his face turning red as he ranted about how I was an ungrateful son who was trying to blackmail his own father. The rage in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from him before. It was the sound of a man whose entire world was crumbling and who was lashing out at anything within reach. But then, just as suddenly as the explosion had started, it stopped, and my father collapsed into a chair and buried his face in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could hear him breathing heavily like he had just run a marathon. And when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with tears that I had never seen before in my entire life. What came out of his mouth next will stay with me forever, because for the first time in 28 years, my father spoke to me with complete honesty. He told me that everything I had found was true, that he had been living a lie for over 30 years, pretending to be someone he wasn't because he was terrified of what people would think if they knew who he really was. He said that when he married my mother, he thought he could force himself to be straight, that he could pray away his desires and become the man everyone expected him to be. But the feelings never went away and only got stronger over time. Through his tears, he admitted that every cruel word he had ever spoken to me was really directed at himself, that he attacked my character because he was jealous of my freedom to be authentic, jealous that I could live my life without the crushing weight of shame that had been destroying him from the inside. He told me that watching me grow up comfortable with who I was, even if I struggled with confidence, made him realize how much of his own life he had wasted trying to be someone else. The man who had spent decades calling me weak and inadequate was now sobbing in front of me, confessing that he was the weak one, that he had been a coward who took out his self-hatred on his own son because it was easier than facing his own truth. He said that every time he looked at me, he saw the person he wished he could have been, someone who didn't live in constant fear of judgment, someone who didn't have to hide behind a mask of fake righteousness. In that moment, sitting across from my broken father, as he finally told the truth about his life, I realized that his cruelty toward me had never been about me at all. It had always been about his own internal war with shame, addiction to forbidden desires, and the prison he had built around himself with lies. The rain pounded against the windows as Diego found his father sitting on the porch, staring into emptiness. For the first time, there was no rage in the older man's eyes, just a deep exhaustion that seemed to carry decades of weight. "Son," the voice came out hoarse, barely audible. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." Diego approached slowly, recognizing something different in this moment. The father, who had always roared like a wounded animal, now seemed just human. "All these years, I attacked you because I saw in you something I could never be." The words came with difficulty, as if each one cost years of his life. "Your courage to be who you are, to live your truth, it triggered a rage in me that I couldn't explain. The trigger was there, that ancestral fury that exploded whenever he saw Diego being authentic. But now, for the first time, he could name it. It was envy, Diego. Pure envy. You had what I always wanted, the freedom to be yourself." His eyes filled with tears held back for decades. "I lived an entire life pretending to be someone I wasn't, prisoner to others' expectations, to my own lies." Diego felt something shifting inside his chest. This man who had always seemed like an uncontrolled Hulk, destroying everything around him, was revealing himself as someone who had been destroying himself inside for years. "Dad," Diego sat beside him, "I always thought you hated me." I hated myself, and I projected that onto you. The confession came out like a sigh of relief. You constantly reminded me of the coward I was, of the authentic life I never had the courage to live. For the first time, Diego could see beyond his father's rage. He saw a broken man who attacked precisely what he most admired. The identification was painful but liberating. How many times had he himself attacked others out of envy disguised as anger? "It's not too late, Dad." Diego placed his hand on the shoulder of the man he had always feared. "We can start over. We can build something real between us, based on truth instead of lies." The father looked at his son with wonder, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Can you forgive me for all the damage?" "Isn't about forgetting the pain," Diego replied. "It's about choosing love over resentment. And I choose to love you, Dad. The real you, not the mask you wore." They sat in silence, listening to the rain wash away years of accumulated hurt. Two men, finally free to be themselves with each other. My transformation began in the shadows of rejection, where I had learned to shrink myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. For years, I carried my father's anger like poison in my veins, internalizing every harsh word as truth about my worth. The old me would trigger into defensive rage whenever confronted with criticism, my inner Hulk emerging to protect the wounded child inside. I lived in constant fear of judgment, molding myself into whatever shape I thought would earn approval, losing pieces of my authentic self along the way. But transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow burn of recognition and choice. The first shift came when I began to identify the patterns. I saw how my father's attacks weren't about my flaws, but about his own imprisoned truth. This identification cracked something open inside me, a window of understanding that revealed the difference between someone else's pain and my own reality. "I am not my father's disappointment" became my daily mantra. I am not the repository for his unhealed wounds. Each day, I practiced catching myself before the old triggers could hijack my nervous system. When criticism came, instead of immediately assuming I was fundamentally broken, I learned to pause and ask, "Is this about me, or is this their pain speaking?" The breakthrough moment came during a heated argument with a colleague who called me too sensitive. The old me would have either exploded in defensive anger or collapsed into shame. Instead, I felt the familiar Hulk energy rising and chose differently. I breathed through the trigger and responded with clarity. My sensitivity is my strength, not my weakness. This wasn't about becoming emotionally numb or building walls. I developed what I called emotional discernment, the ability to feel deeply while not taking on others' projections as my identity. I learned that empathy didn't require self-sacrifice, that understanding someone's pain didn't mean accepting their abuse. With my father, the identification became a bridge rather than a trap. I could see the scared, insecure man behind the rage without making excuses for the damage caused. This understanding birthed genuine compassion, not the kind that enables, but the kind that sees clearly and chooses love anyway. My courage grew not from becoming fearless, but from acting despite the fear. I started speaking my truth in small moments, expressing disagreement in meetings, setting boundaries with friends, choosing authenticity over people-pleasing. Each act of courage strengthened my inner foundation. The man who emerged was neither the rejected child nor the defensive warrior, but someone entirely new. A person who could hold space for complexity, who understood that people's reactions often reveal more about them than about me, and who finally had the courage to live my own truth without requiring external validation. I had learned the most liberating lesson of all. I was not responsible for managing other people's emotions, triggers, or projections. I was only responsible for my own integrity, my own healing, and my own authentic expression in the world. And you? How many times have you attacked someone for characteristics you secretly wish you had? How many times has your anger toward another person actually been anger toward yourself? Look, I learned that when someone attacks you with great intensity, especially about who you are, that person is saying more about themselves than about you. My father didn't hate me. He hated the prison he built for himself. If you're carrying deep resentment towards someone who hurt you, maybe it's time to look behind the cruelty. Not to excuse it, but to free yourself. Because when you understand that the pain they caused you was a reflection of their internal pain, you stop taking it personally. Stop carrying other people's projections as truths about yourself. You are not what they said you were in their moments of rage. Here's what I want you to understand. That person who triggers your deepest insecurities, who makes your inner Hulk want to explode with defensive anger, they're often reflecting back your own unhealed wounds. The identification is uncomfortable but liberating. What we hate most in others is usually what we can't accept in ourselves. But here's the flip side. When someone attacks you with vicious intensity, especially about your authentic self, pay attention. Their trigger is showing you something important. It's not about you being wrong, it's about them being threatened by what you represent. I used to absorb every criticism like gospel truth. Every harsh word became evidence of my fundamental brokenness. But I learned to ask, is this their pain speaking, or is this actually about me? When your father calls you weak, when your boss says you're too emotional, when someone mocks your dreams, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what does their reaction reveal about their own fears, limitations, or self-hatred? The person who attacks your vulnerability is often someone who's buried their own. The person who mocks your authenticity is usually someone who's lost touch with theirs. The person who triggers your shame is frequently drowning in their own. This doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior or stay in toxic situations. It means you stop internalizing their poisonous truth about your worth. You have permission to stop being the dumping ground for other people's unprocessed trauma. You have permission to recognize their triggers as their responsibility, not your identity. The moment you truly understand that their attack was never about you, that's the moment you become free. Free to be authentically yourself without requiring their approval. Free to live your truth without fear of their judgment. Stop shrinking yourself to manage other people's triggers. Stop dimming your light to make others comfortable. Their discomfort with your authenticity is information about them, not instruction for you. You are not responsible for other people's emotional reactions to your existence. You are only responsible for living with integrity and treating others with basic human respect. The people who truly see you, who celebrate your authentic self, those are your people. Everyone else is just showing you their own wounds. Today, my dad is in therapy, rebuilding his life at 58. I've learned that family isn't about perfection. It's about having the courage to be honest with each other. If you've discovered family secrets that have changed everything, if you've been the target of projections from someone you love, or if you're still trying to understand why certain people hurt you so much, share your story in the comments. This channel exists for that, to show each other that behind all cruelty lies human pain, and that healing begins when we stop running from the truth. When someone awakens your deepest wounds, when it makes your inner Hulk want to rage or retreat, remember, their attack often reveals more about your prison than it does about your flaws. Recognizing that cruelty comes from your own unhealed places is painful, but necessary. Acknowledging that this person's cruelty comes from your own unhealed places. If you've healed from something like this, be a light to those still in the darkness. If you're still struggling, know that you're not alone. We are all on this journey together to discover who we really are behind the masks we have learned to wear. Your story matters. Your healing journey matters. And sometimes, sharing your truth becomes the key that unlocks someone else's prison, so we ask that you share your story here in the comments. Keep watching this video that is playing on